Let's see about rebooting the stream. You can buy venison. Yeah, you can absolutely buy venison. You probably will have to go to a specialty butcher for it, because venison is really expensive. Which is why I say if I were to work with venison, I would be very, very careful not to mess it up. I don't think that I would go off book and do like a lobchon carbonara venison or something like that, because I would be too worried about wasting venison. If we went venison, I would probably spend like $30–40 on venison. Which is actually, I kind of feel that way anytime that I work with steak too, but here we are. Cool. Is the name of the show Take on Yan Can Cook? Yeah, so the name of the show, Wu Can Cook, it's derived from a show called Yan Can Cook, which is hosted by a guy named Martin Yan. Martin Yan is actually still out. He's doing stuff. He has an Instagram that's really, really popular. And I believe he just released a General Tso's chicken, a frozen series of General Tso's chicken that you can get at Costco, which is, honestly, it's just really cool to see Martin Yan doing stuff, because I thought that he had retired, because I hadn't heard from him in a really, really long time. So if you don't know about Martin Yan's PBS series, I highly recommend looking it up. And he had this way of using this really, really giant cleaver and then just staring directly at you, and then just chopping like faster than any human should be chopping. You should definitely, if you're chopping that fast, you should just look down. You just look down. So if you haven't checked out Yan Can Cook, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite shows. So yes, it is an homage to Martin Yan's show. How do I decide on what recipes to make? Usually, a lot of the time it goes off the cuff. Actually, a lot of them are based off of requests. So people request stuff all the time, and a lot of the things that I cook are coming from requests. So let's see, the thing that we did a dandan mian that was pretty recent. That was a request. I think the jianbing was a request. Both of those were coming from the Oakland subreddit. We did, I believe, gimbap was a request. A lot of times, especially if they're coming from the TV and film series, it will just be inspired by me watching TV, and then I'll cook the thing that I saw on TV. So the version that we're doing right now is inspired by a show called Marvel's The Defenders, which is a discontinued Marvel TV series that was out on Netflix for a little while. And I was watching that show, and I saw broccoli beef, and I decided to cook it. And I actually talked about that in the YouTube video too. So, but yeah, good question. Ooh, but you know what? Before we do that, I'm gonna turn the camera on. And I almost forgot to do this, so what we're going to do before we move on and start cooking our steak is we're going to drain off this liquid here. So this is a combination of things now. What's at the bottom of this bowl is mainly our marinade, but also it is our baking soda. So by the way, it went for 22 minutes, which is almost long enough. And what we want to do is pour off all of that liquid, because what's left behind at this point is going to be mostly baking soda. So we want to make sure that as much of that baking soda gets out of our steak as possible. Otherwise, that's going to end up in our stir fry, which is going to taste a little bit bitter, a little bit metallic, kind of like you were eating beans out of a can. You would kind of like taste the metallic qualities that are coming off of the beans, which is not attractive. We don't want to taste that. Can you trade Reddit awards in for cash? I don't think that you can. I have, if you can, that would be cool, because I have a lot of Reddit awards. But no, I don't think you can. It's just fun internet karma. Oh yeah, deer hunting. Yeah, that would be the best way to get yourself some cheap venison. All right, so here's our wok. It's ripping hot, and then we're gonna add, this is about 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. And then as always, we're doing our long yao to get this wok nice and coated for our non-stick surface. And then we're doing our steak sear first. So in going 1 piece at a time is our steak. And I'm being very careful, just like we do anytime that we're searing something. I'm adding my steak flat side down with the largest surface area facing downward. So that's going to help us get the most amount of sear as possible on each piece of steak. So you'll notice that we're facing that down, and I also probably should be using tongs, but here we are. And we're facing that flat side down, and that's going to help us get this nice and crispy. Also, at this point, if you have a flat bottom pan, especially if you have a flat bottom wok, that would be probably the most useful time to have it. You'll notice that I have here my round bottom wok, which is working just fine. I've actually gotten pretty good to work around using this flat round bottom wok. But the main problem with working with a round bottom wok here is that things don't really seem to, all of the oil is kind of pulling up right here. And that's really, really useful when you're stir frying because it means that you can bloom things in that oil right here. But when we're searing, like we're doing right now, we need to make sure that that oil is in contact with all of our steak, not just the stuff that's at the bottom. So what I like to do is give it a little bit of a rotation and make sure that that oil is touching everything. So at this point, if you had a flat bottom skillet, say if we were doing this, say flat bottom cast iron, that would totally solve the problem because all of the oil would be evenly distributed. In our case right now, this is causing a little bit of problem, but it'll be okay. Clark, what kind of knife did I use at the beginning? Yeah, lots of people ask about the knife. It's a Père Noir Nugent. It's a French chef's knife. It's made out of carbon steel. Lots of people ask about that knife. I should probably make sure that I'm pronouncing that right. I maybe should just learn a little bit of French too. But it's a French chef's knife. It's a little bit longer than a standard chef's knife. At least here in the States, the standard chef's knife is about 8 inches long. Sometimes they run around like closer to 10 inches. So it's a little bit longer, but I actually am a big fan of it. That particular knife that I own, I found it at an antique sale or an estate sale for really cheap. I think I got it for like $10. And I think it's worth like $200-300 actually. So you're not going to be able to find that particular knife because it's kind of rare. And also like it's not just rare, it's actually more obscure than it is rare. But there is a more famous version of that knife that's made by a company called Sabatier. So if you're looking for that knife, you should look for the Sabatier, I always recommend. And Sabatier is actually still in production, so I think you can buy Sabatiers at like Macy's and stuff. So, all right. Cool. So let's give this a flip. A little bit longer. I'm gonna let that go for a little bit longer. Ooh, eggs Benedict. Yeah, I could totally do that. Yeah, it's a handsome knife. Yeah, I love that knife. It's one of my favorites. What I have found, so it's made out of carbon steel, which is honestly, carbon steel is my favorite metal. Mostly for a couple of reasons. This wok is made out of carbon steel, and I love it because it has really, really good heat conduction. But another part about carbon steel that I love is that it just sort of ages as you age. So it develops this really nice patina. It almost looks like it's rusting, but it's not rust. It's just age, which I love about that particular knife. The downside with carbon steel, especially if you're using a carbon steel knife, is that it is not really super susceptible to be covering in water. So if you're using a carbon steel knife, you will notice that I do this a lot of times. Pretty much every time that I'm using the knife on camera, I'll wipe it down after every time that I use it, or pretty much any time that I set it down, I'll have to wipe it off. And that's because if you leave water on carbon steel, it immediately oxidizes within like 5 minutes, which is a real pain. It could potentially damage the knife pretty badly. That is probably the only downside to that knife, is that you have to wipe it off all the time. Whereas like if you had, say, like a normal like a plain old like stainless steel knife, for example, you don't have to do that. You can pretty much stainless steel will never rust. It will never do anything. That's why they call it stainless. So when we do cook at like really large volumes, so when we cook for the food booth or the food pop-up, I actually have a second knife, like a backup knife that I use sometimes. It's just I think it's an 8-inch Wusthof. It's really standard chef's knife, and a lot of times I'll just end up using that because I can like set it down and I don't have to worry about making sure to wipe it off all the time. All right, so that's our steak. I'm gonna give this a quick toss. We've got a nice sear going on this steak, as you can see. We're also cooking in batches here, so I'm gonna dump that off now. And then what I like to do, so I don't particularly recommend saving fond all the time. In this particular case today, we are going to save our fond. But what I like to do is only save it on the second batch, because if we leave this stuff behind here, it's going to start burning, which is kind of disappointing, because essentially what you're wiping off right now as we clean our wok is a lot of flavors. So that's all like steak fat, beef juice, and like all of this really, really delicious stuff that's going to contribute to flavor. But I will also say is that it's really, really important as you batch cook in a sear to clean that stuff off, because if you leave it behind, it will go from like nice fond into just really, really burnt stuff, which is not attractive. So very, very important as we cook, wipe down that wok. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our second sear, and then we're going to do the exact same thing, but on the second time, instead of wiping it down, we're going to deglaze that with a little bit of stock, and that's going to be the basis of our sauce. So we're doing the exact same thing again. Once again, I should probably be using tongs. It'll be fine. So just like we did with our first batch, I'm making sure that my steak is facing flat side down, so we have the most amount of surface area hitting our wok as possible. And then we're just working outward from there. So you'll notice once again, all of the oil, it's forming at the bottom of my wok, right there at the center. We're going to be also very, very careful to make sure that we rotate our wok and get all of that oil circulating around the wok so that we don't end up with unevenly cooked steak. So once again, if you do own a flat bottom skillet or something, if you have a flat bottom wok, this would be a good time to use it. The main reason that I'm using this wok right now is so that I don't have to clean two pans. That's really the only reason. Yeah. Crayon, that's a good one. Yeah, the Eggs Benedict, yeah, totally. I could totally do an Eggs Benedict. That would be a really interesting one. I've been working on this series where we've been like assembling like really, really westernized or like European, Western-centric or European-based recipes and involving Asian things in it. That's why I was cooking a lapchang carbonara that was just like a glorious crash and burn. I'm probably going to post some photos of it because it went horribly. I cannot stress enough how badly it went, which was really surprising because I cooked it twice already. And the first two times it went really great, but when I sat down and tried to film it, it just went horribly, and I don't know why it went so badly. But yeah, that would be a really fun one to do, the Eggs Benedict. I've also been we've been doing a couple of different versions of like Chinese tacos. So I've been thinking about doing like a General Tso's chicken with a taco. That would be really cool. Oh, Who Can't Cook cookbook? Yeah, that's probably coming eventually. That'll happen eventually. I have to think about how I want to organize something like that, because I don't want to just put out like a plain old cookbook. I want to do like interesting stories and kind of work on. I want to do something interesting with it, so I have to really think about how to execute something like that, and we'll also have to figure out funding. I don't think it's cheap to publish a book for sure. So. But yeah, totally. That's on my to-do list as a cookbook. But in the meantime, all of those recipes, they do live over on the website, so that's a good place to start, at least. But eventually, yeah, a large physical cookbook, that would be super cool. All right, let's give these a flip. Yeah, some of these are looking a little bit uneven, but I think they'll be okay. There we go. So you'll notice as we flip these over, the ones that are cooking fastest are the ones that are in the oil, so the ones that are at the bottom of the wok. And that's not a coincidence. That's because that's where all of the oil is sitting. So that's another reason why, or another reminder why it's super important to make sure that we rotate this wok super frequently so that that oil kind of circulates. Otherwise, we're going to have unevenly cooked steak. But I think we're okay. Yeah. Yeah, cool. So I just flipped all of our steak over. We're gonna let that go for maybe another like 30-45 seconds, not super long. Unlike chicken, our steak, it doesn't have to be fully cooked. We can go a little bit medium rare or medium, and it will be fine. So we don't have to be worried about like making sure that our steak reaches a certain internal temperature. At this point, we can pull it off and it would be edible. It would probably be on the side of like more rare, which is not super great. But yeah, salt and pepper cod. That's a big one on my to-do list. I'm still working on finding cod, or like a good source of cod. But yeah, that salt and pepper cod, and also tom yum soup, which is a Thai like shrimp-based soup. Those are both like high on my to-do list, and just sort of like two elements that I don't work with a lot. I don't use cod quite all that often. All right. So real quick, we could take a look at our finished steak. Come on, there you are. So here's our finished steak. It is nice and crispy and seared. We could take a look at all of that deep dark brown caramelization, or a Maillard reaction. That's not necessarily a caramelization. Actually, part of it is caramelization. And that's going to be all of our really crispy steak. It is also probably the most tender pieces of steak that we'll come across, unless you ever do a full velveting and don't stop it at 22 minutes like I just did. And then, so the last thing that we're doing here, so you'll notice at the bottom of my wok is all of this fat. And if we were cooking European food, we would refer to that as fond. It's essentially all of that leftover stuff that gets left behind when you cook stuff. So we use this. This is something that comes up in a lot of things like bologneses and carbonaras. A lot of Italian food and a lot of French food will use fond. And what we're going to do is use that as the basis for our sauce. So this is not something that you will see happen in a lot of Chinese food. It's just not really a technique that happens in a lot of Chinese food. I don't actually know why it doesn't happen super often. But what I can say is that it is really effective in building like really deep and tasty sauces. So we are going to do it today. I have also not particularly been in the habit of using using fond in stir fries, mostly because it's just not something that you do in Chinese cooking. But I'm also starting to realize there's no real reason why it's not done in Chinese cooking. So what's also important to point out is that we're only doing this with the second half of our batch cook. So if we had left it, so I wiped down the wok after our first batch. That was really important. If we didn't remember to wipe that stuff off, we would have ended up with a bunch of charred stuff at the bottom, this is technically charred stuff, but it's a controlled char. So there's my stock going in, and then what we're going to do is deglaze our wok here, which is essentially scraping off all of that stuff. So all of that fat is going to get deglazed into our stock here. And then we're going to add our sauce. Add a little bit of extra water. And then finally, this is going to be our cornstarch slurry going in. And that cornstarch is going to start creating this nice thick and cohesive sauce. If you did it right. Which I usually like to let that reduce just a little bit. Sometimes it looks a little bit thicker than I'd like. I like to leak it a little bit watery, but for the most part, we want that sauce to be relatively, like almost completely reduced. So we want to get out of the world of, we don't want to be reducing that sauce once we're into our stir fries. The reason that we don't want to do that is because if you find yourself reducing the sauce while you're stir frying. So if the broccoli and the beef are already in the wok, and then you start reducing this sauce, you're gonna get into the world of what you're essentially doing is boiling the beef and boiling that broccoli, which is gonna get you in the world of like mushy and like kind of porridgey stir fries, which is not super great. So there's our sauce. It is looking relatively thick and cohesive, so I'm going to pour this out. And then I'm going to give this wok a wipe down, and we're going to get to our stir fry. So you'll notice at this point, the rest of our stir fry is going to start happening really quick. I want to say the rest of this stir fry is going to come together in maybe 5 minutes, maybe even less than that. So I just rinsed off our wok. We're going to get all of that gunk off. So I'm going to take a paper towel and wipe off anything that lay stuck behind. Shouldn't be too much stuff. Seems like most of that just came right off. If you have a well-seasoned carbon steel, that stuff should really just come right off. You shouldn't be finding yourself doing too much scrubbing at this point. The slurry was cornstarch and water, yeah. So it's 2 tablespoons of cornstarch mixed with water. So the quantity of water is not super important. What's more important is that it was 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. And then what we're looking for is just dissolving that cornstarch in water. So we want it to be in a liquid form so that we're not just dumping solid cornstarch straight into our wok. If you do that, I actually have done that. If you're lucky, you might get away with it, but probably most likely what will happen if you just throw solid cornstarch into a wok fry is that it's just going to stay together. So you're just going to have this big block of cornstarch, and then it's not going to thicken up sauces. It's just going to sit. And you're going to be eating a big blob of cornstarch, which is not attractive. And I have done that before. People don't like it when you do that. Cool. So once our wok is nice and hot, I'm adding, this is going to be another 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. And then in first are my aromatics, so that's my ginger, followed by my garlic. And then we're going to bloom that until it becomes fragrant. That's usually about 10 seconds, but use your nose at this point, when you start smelling garlic and ginger, that's when you know you're in a good space. Yeah, STT Voyager, thank you. I love streaming. All right, next up is our broccoli, which once again, we remember that we strained this quite a bit, so there's not going to be too much water in here. I also left it in the strainer, which I didn't necessarily mean to do, but that also helps drain out some of that water. At this point, if you were adding additional vegetables, what I would say is give that broccoli, the first thing that should go in is probably the broccoli, and give it a good solid like a minute or maybe even 2 minutes head start. And then if you're using things like say like a bell pepper or an onion, I would say follow it up from there. If you're using something more delicate, so if you're using like carrots or a bell pepper, those would be something to follow up after maybe about 2 minutes of a head start. And if you're using things that are a little bit more delicate, say like onions or mushrooms, stuff like that, those are really, really delicate veggies, you want to throw those in at the very, very end. So like literally no more than like a minute, maybe a minute and a half before you pull it out of the fire. Yeah. So we're gonna let that broccoli go. I want to say that's gonna go for maybe another minute, and then we're gonna add everything back to the wok, combine, and that's gonna be about it. At this point, if you've been following along, you'll have realized that we have essentially at this point cooked everything. So we finished cooking our sauce, we finished cooking our beef. Everything at this point has been cooked, so the last thing that we have to do really is just combine. And so we're gonna throw everything together, and that'll be it. Yeah. It's almost there. All right, so here's our steak going back in. I'm also going to be generous about including some of that fat. And then next up is our sauce. So I'm going to actually get this spatula out. It's a little bit tight, so I'm going to add a little bit more water here. A little bit more water. Once again, if you have done things correctly, you should not be in the world of reducing your sauce at all. We should really just be tossing things to combine, so we shouldn't be cooking at all at this point. If you are still cooking, that's probably a real bad sign, because it probably means that you're doing things like boiling and steaming stuff. It's going to be getting you into that world of getting a really, really porridgey stir fry, which is never what we're after. So you will notice that once we think through things together, I think we maybe were cooking for about a minute, maybe even less than that. And then the last thing that we're going to do anytime that we finish cooking in a wok is that we want to rinse it off. So clean that wok while it's hot. So while your wok is hot, especially if you have a carbon steel wok like this one, they're going to be a lot easier to clean while it's still warm. Once it cools down, it's going to be a lot more tricky to clean because things will have stuck to the wok at that point. So do yourself a big favor and clean this thing while it's hot, or relatively hot at least, because otherwise, if you go and sit down and eat and then try and clean your wok, you're going to be doing things like scrubbing. You're probably going to have to get some steel wool out. Not fun. So do yourself a favor. It's not going to damage the wok if you do mess it up. I have definitely messed this up on occasion. But do yourself a favor if you don't want to be scrubbing woks endlessly. Is clean it while it's hot. And that's it. We just gave it a quick wipe down, and it's ready to cook again. Cool. All right. Do I ever make a dessert to go with my main meal? I make a lot of desserts, but not to go with the main meal, though. Usually if I make a dessert, it's because I just want a dessert, or because I'm doing a menu or a recipe. We did do a dessert on stream recently. We did the jindui, which is a sesame rice ball. Which is like, I guess is like you could think of it as like fried mochi, but no, I generally don't, unless I'm doing something for a special occasion. I generally don't also cook a dessert. That would be crazy. It would be super fat. Although, why not? this rim a little bit. Yeah, RK, how's it going? RKK6. What's up? It's the first time I think I've seen you pop over on the YouTube channel. Let's do it this way. This feels a little bit off balance. Maybe I could be more careful about it. Yeah. Yeah. Despor, what cut of beef is it? Yeah, good question. No worries. Yeah, you just tuned in. That's totally cool. This is a so today we're using flank steak. If you were for the folks who have been watching since the beginning, you'll know I haven't been able to get my hands on flank steak for a super long time. I actually have no idea why I haven't been able to find flank steak. I honestly think it's because I have a shitty butcher, and I think because at one point I asked him for flank steak and he told me what's flank steak, which is dumb. But if you can't find flank steak, you could do what I've done, which is I've just been using top cut Angus sirloin steak for a while, which is a really good alternative. I think when I did the recipe for this particular broccoli beef, I used top cut Angus sirloin because for that exact reasons I haven't been able to find flank steak for a while. To me, they're very, very similar cuts of steak. They're both very, very lean. They're both relatively cheap. I think top cut Angus is a little bit more expensive, but honestly, if you're working with steak, it's going to be a little bit more expensive anyway. So if you can get your hands on either top cut Angus or flank steak, both of them are going to work really, really great. What's like probably the biggest thing about the meat that we're using today is that we did a velveting on it. So we used a little bit of baking soda, about a quarter teaspoon of baking soda dissolved in a quarter cup of water, and then added that to our marinade for about 30 minutes. And that's going to give us this really, really tender piece of steak, which we can try. Oh yeah, super tender. I said this the last time that we did it, but honestly, if I didn't know better, if I didn't know what I was eating, if I also didn't just cook this, I would have guessed that this would be a much more expensive piece of steak. I probably would have guessed this would be like a New York strip steak or something a lot more fatty. It definitely has that really, really tender piece of steak that you like, or that tender quality to it that generally comes from like a piece of steak that's been butter basted in a pan for a really, really long time. And then just sort of like served at like a medium rare, so it's really, really tender. That's what velveting is doing. It's just giving you this really, really tender piece of steak. And honestly, I don't think I've come across any other way of doing a steak that results in turning a really cheap piece of steak into something this tender. There's the only way that I've ever come across that will get you a piece of steak that's this tender. Yeah, YouTube is much better. Yeah, it's no lagging. Yeah, I've heard that the Reddit channel has been lagging quite a bit lately, and I genuinely don't know why. I'm not trying to make the YouTube channel better. I want them both to be good, but I have no idea why I can't get the Reddit stream to work properly. So, yeah. Yeah, what kind of beef do you need to make it? Yeah, so you could do it. I've done this. I have used interchangeably. I don't necessarily think that they are interchangeable, but I've used top cut Angus sirloin. I've also used flank steak, and I've also used skirt steak for this. I again don't think that they're necessarily interchangeable. Flank steak and top cut Angus are going to be a little bit more tender. I think that skirt steak has like a little bit more defined grain to it, so it gets a little bit more chewy, and you kind of have to be a little bit more careful with how you chop it. But honestly, if you can get your hands on any of those types of steak, you could probably make it work. And I have on many occasions just used skirt steak. The really tricky part about skirt steak actually is that it has a little bit more tendon to it. So you're probably going to need to pay attention and make sure that you cut around that tendon, which you want to be really careful with. If you're working with skirt steak, it will look like it's fat, so it's going to have like a little bit of white stuff to it. Which also reminds me, if you're working with skirt steak, or actually if you're working with any kind of lean cut of steak, you want to look for the piece of steak that doesn't have any of that white stuff going on. So what it looks like from like outside of the packaging it looks like it's fat. So it's like got little pieces of white stuff that's going on, which will trick you into thinking, if you were like used to buying like a New York strip steak or something, it will trick you into thinking that that's marbling and that's going to render fat. But it's not fat, it's actually tendon because it's coming from the flank. And that tendon is not edible at all. So what you want to do when you take it home, you're going to have to cut that tendon off. So that right there is a big downside, because it means that remember that you buy steak by the pound, right? So whatever it is that you cut off, you're literally throwing away money. So the more steak that you can buy that has less tendon, the more money that you're saving. You're essentially getting more steak with your buck. So you could get a pound and a half of steak for super cheap, but if it's all tendon, it's not going to be worth it, which I have done. I have bought flank steak that is all tendon, and it was a waste of $20. I thought that because I got like 4 pounds of flank steak for $20, and this is a great deal. And then I looked closer and it's like, oh, it's all tendon. That kind of sucks. So when you're shopping for flank steak, or really any kind of steak that's a really lean cut, so that's flank steaks, top cut sirloin. I haven't had that much problem with top cut, but definitely skirt steak. Pay attention to that tendon and that membrane to make sure that there's as little of it as possible. I also like to look when I buy those kinds of steak, how the steak is chopped. So you want to remember that when you're working with all 3 of these, so that includes flank steak, skirt steak, and top cut Angus sirloin, is that anytime that you're working with it, you're going to want to be cutting against the grain as much as possible. So what that means is when you buy that piece of flank steak, you want to pay attention to how the butcher has cut it too. So what we're looking for is that when you go and put that piece of steak on your cutting board, how much are you going to have to cut with the grain? So you'll notice that the piece of steak that we used today, I only did 1 cut that was with the grain, and that was to get things into a manageable bite. And then the rest of my cuts were against the grain. So if you're not paying attention and you get a piece of steak that's been chopped in a weird way, and you're going to end up having to chop with the grain quite a bit in order to get the size of piece of steak that you're looking for, that's not a great thing. So those are all the things that I look for when I look at steak. Is like, what direction is the grain going? How has the butcher chopped it? Is there a lot of membrane going on? Is it actually a good deal per pound? Yeah, local Mexican markets for flank steak. Yeah, the closest local Mexican market for me is like clear across town. It's like a solid 10 miles away. So I haven't been in the habit of going all the way to Cardenas. If you're in Oakland, Cardenas is a great local Mexican market. But it's like super far away, so I don't really bother. And I could get flank steak for not even that cheap. It's actually pretty expensive. I think this cut of flank steak was like, I want to say it's like $14 a pound, which flank steak should not be $14 a pound. I think at Cardenas you could get it for like $5 a pound or something. You tried top round for your stir fry, but you was disappointed. Oh yeah, you might have cut with the grain too much. Yeah, so that's like super tricky. So it's not something that you have to think about quite as much if you're doing like, say, like filet mignon, or if you're using like even a New York strip, or even like a ribeye. You don't really have to think about it as much, because the fat content of the steak is keeping it nice and tender for you. So you could cut as much as you want with the grain. That's why you could serve it on the plate, and it won't necessarily get that chewy. But with a really lean cut of steak, you're gonna want to be super careful. Also, top round is really cheap, so you're eating cheap steak. So there's only so much that you can really expect. But if you are having a lot of trouble getting that steak nice and tender, I highly recommend doing the velveting technique, especially if you're doing like a stir fry like this. It's gonna be a game changer. Yeah, a beef 101 course. Yeah, that's been another thing that I've been planning for the YouTube channel. It's like a wok cooking 101 thing. So maybe that's something that we should talk about. I probably should start writing this stuff down. But I was thinking like it would be cool to do a series where we could like talk about how to fry eggs in a wok, and like maybe like a whole series that's dedicated just like how to fry chicken in a wok, stuff like that. So that would be fun to do. Also, I feel like I have accumulated enough knowledge to do something like that. So cool. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. Let me know if you have any more questions. I'll be here doing dishes, so feel free to drop those in the chat if you want. If you haven't yet, if you're watching on Reddit and you haven't checked it out yet, there's a YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. We are also always concurrently live streaming over there. Sometimes it crashes like it did today, but it's not crashing. On that YouTube channel, that live stream, it has a whole schedule of everything that we're going to cook. So the folks who are watching over on YouTube knew several weeks ago that we will be cooking this on live stream. Because there's a whole schedule and you can find out what we're going to cook next. You could tune in for the stuff that you want. Lots of people have been doing so those schedules have a list of all of the things that go into the things that I'm cooking. So if you want, you can pick up the ingredients. You can cook along with me too if you want. You can tell me about the things that you messed up. I know I messed up at least one thing today. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely find your way over to the YouTube channel and check out what's going on over there. We're working our way up to 4,500 subs by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Lots of fun stuff going on over there. We have new recipes coming out every Friday. So last Friday was the recipe for this broccoli beef. This Friday coming up, which is tomorrow, is going to be some sweet and sour chicken, which is one of a very interesting way of doing fried chicken that I have recently gotten into. I also have recently learned how much ketchup there is in a lot of Chinese food. So yeah, Clark. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad it was informative. Thanks, everyone. Cool. Yeah, so if you're interested in stuff like that, find your way over to the YouTube channel and subscribe. If you're not interested, please don't subscribe. I don't know why people do that. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be here doing dishes. Yeah, thanks, Clark. Good night. All right. Bye, everyone.
If you think that you don't know, never mind that you still don't love yourself. No, you can find it from somebody else. No, everybody's got to grow up. Sometimes funny how we shoot the move. Still, will we fight it, baby? Alright, never mind. Yes, I found it now. I'm falling in love with love, and it's bringing me down. You want to be, baby, yes. You want to be, baby. Everybody wants to be nothing. They still got dreams, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got dreams, but more like a junkie of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. Want to be, baby, yes, sir. You're real sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your lip all the time. I look for love on the same old places. Found the bottom of the barrel was always high. But you poured out your heart, and I didn't want to waste it. There's nothing like love to give me high. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. Ooh, yeah. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time.
Keep my hands on myself. Think I'll dust them off, put them back up on the shelf. Case my little baby girl is in need. Am I coming out of left field? Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. I've been feeling it since 1966 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Got another mouth to feed. Leaving with the babysitter, mama call the grave digger. Gone with the falling leaves. Am I coming out of left field? Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. I've been feeling it since 1966 now. Might have had your fill, but I feel it still. Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, I can feel it still. We can fight a war for peace. Give in to that easy living. Goodbye to my hopes and dreams. Stop flipping for my enemies. We could wait until the walls come down. It's time to give a little to the kids in the middle, but oh, until it falls, won't bother me. I'm a rebel
Sacrifice